Lee Forrester, and it's time for another episode of Metal on Metal. We're looking at the Grand Tactical Series today. What specifically? Well, some people on YouTube suggest that maybe I actually complete the tutorial series I started many years ago. So I thought, yeah, that's a good idea. And we're on to tutorial number 5 for the GTS series. And in this tutorial, we're going to look at engineering actions, and that's it. Now, that may seem like not so much, but as you'll see, engineering actions are really important to improving your GTS game, and I will argue that case as follows. First of all, we'll look at engineering actions themselves, what they are, who does them, and then some of the things that can happen. We have roadblocks, or Sperren in German. Mines in most of the GTS 2.0 games, those aren't in the core rules, but each individual game might add them in there. We'll look at rear guards, or Nachhuten if you prefer, improved positions, entrenchments, and then some tips and tricks for using engineering actions to improve your game. I think of engineering as a force multiplier. Now, you have engineer counters in the game, such as the German, these are the Pioniere, and they're pretty good at combat, actually, with that kind of assault factor. Allied engineers tend to not be so combat focused, but I strongly encourage you to not think of these as more line troops, but to use these to multiply your force and improve everybody else that's there. Operationally, engineers are super important at mobility. In the tactical game, it's not quite as important. They have other uses. Here on the right, I have a way of thinking about troops and what they're doing in 3 postures they can take: movement, striking, and protecting. Engineers at the operational level are actually very good at improving mobility and movement. They build bridges, clear roads, that sort of thing, improve roads. In the GTS game, though, you'll find them more often used to protect as well and to inhibit enemy movement. They have some ability to strike, as we'll see. So think of these as multiplying the ability of your other units and not as adding them additionally yourselves. I would recommend that your engineers always be busy helping other troops and not actually engaging in combat themselves. That's a challenge to you. Let's look at engineer actions in particular. Here's the chart from the GTS rules about all the actions that are allowed during which chit pulls. Down here, you'll see a few really important holes. Engineering actions cannot be used with direct command chits or second actions of the formation and division, blanks. So you can't use CPs on engineering actions. You're going to be focused on the quality roll, the QR, and that's really important for engineers. So their QR rating, here is a 6 and there's a 3, will dictate a lot of their abilities. When you use engineering actions, you have to make the quality roll, but you may fail. And if you do, you get a digging marker to put on it. That adds a +1 to the next attempt. So units attempting engineering actions can keep at it with an increased bonus every turn until they succeed. Also important to remember that engineering actions do provide opportunity fire to your opponent. So as a consequence, you're not going to want to do that while you're in a fire zone. That means engineering actions are best done further behind the lines. You can use barrages and other tricks to limit the fire zones, but engineers themselves, these are okay, but some of them have a pretty bad defense. So you want to plan your engineering actions out of range of the enemy if at all possible. That's another important part with engineering actions. Let's look at roadblocks. In my experience, I don't see many roadblocks in play. It takes an engineer to place them. And an engineer can remove them automatically without having to make a roll. Normal foot troops can remove roadblocks if they're sitting on them by making their quality roll. And so you see they're hard to put down. The engineers have to make their roll. They're pretty easy to pick up. And for that reason, there seem to be other things engineers are up to. However, you must not forget that these exist, and they do have some very specific uses. I'll point this out in a second. A roadblock in place essentially negates the road for the hex that it's in, except for units of the division. Each roadblock will have a division marker because it's for a specific division. Roadblocks obviously affect all enemy troops, but they also affect your own troops if they're from a different division. So you have to keep that in mind when you place those. If you've got multiple divisions operating in the same area, a roadblock might be more of a pain than it's worth. So if these are hard to build and you don't see them used so much, what uses do they have? Well, they're great at flank protection. Here's a situation in the strike counter-strike game. If you've seen that game, most of the action is here to the southeast, and over here, this is up in the northwest corner. There is a river, hard to see right there. Vehicles cannot cross it. And here, woods, vehicles cannot go through there. So essentially, on this flank, the only way to cross this river with a vehicle is via this bridge. What a perfect place to put a Speere for the Germans. This means that the Allied armored cars cannot blitz over here when the Germans aren't looking. You can reinforce this further with mines, which we'll talk about in a minute, maybe taking a unit and placing it there, and if you really want, entrenching it. In that situation, this little hex, if it had a mine, which is an engineering action, and an entrenched infantry unit, also engineering action, could hold up a small Allied advance for almost an entire day. That's nice flank protection. Here, we've thrown another Speere down at another bridge, minor use because an Allied unit here could zip around the flank there, but that does provide some flank protection and gives the defender a few turns to react and stops sort of coup de main flanking runs with fast armored formations that you don't have time to respond to. So to me, that's an excellent use of a Speere or of a roadblock. The next one could be in a race for Bastogne. Here, this is the sort of where Panzerlehr usually ends up coming through, bottlenecked through the woods with a few roads. I threw down a few roadblocks here if you've got the spare engineering actions. This slows the Germans down somewhat, but simple infantry unit can go in there and remove it, so it's not going to be a huge block. However, if you put a roadblock right in front of a defensive position, this improves its ability tremendously. With the roadblock here, German armored tanks cannot enter this hex because there's no road and it's woods. That means you can't run up with an armored unit and kind of blow away or blast away at the defending unit with relative impunity. Naturally, in the woods, it would be in column. That decreases its defense, but it's still not too bad. In this case, the Germans will need to move infantry up. And as we see, some engineers that have done their busy work. They can do other engineering actions, of course, too. You've got some indirect fire to support the thing. This becomes a bit of a firefight. The German will need probably a battalion of infantry and a number of activations to pound through this position because they can't use their tanks. That's a nice use of a roadblock, immediately backed up by some defending forces. All right, so let's move to landmines. This is in most of the GTS games afterwards, but like I said, it's not in the game, the general rules for it. I think the rules are pretty much the same for engineers in all the games off the top of my head. You need to make an engineering roll, a quality roll, in order to place the mine, and only engineers can remove them, so they're a little stickier than roadblocks. What happens is if you move into a minefield, say right here, in order to leave that hex, you have to make a quality roll, and that you can't spend any command points on it. So if you're good morale like a 6, it may not stop you too much. If you're bad morale like a 3, then you may be stuck there for a number of activations. If you attempt it and fail, you're suppressed. And you can imagine that if you're right up against the enemy in that situation, then that's not a good thing. So mines don't block you moving in, but they stop you moving out. You can assault while you're in a mine hex, but if you win and move into the target hex, you have to make that quality roll, and you might be suppressed moving into the hex that you're occupying. So be careful with that. Another cool thing about mines is that if you're occupying your own mine, and your own mines don't affect you in any way, units attacking you via assault have a -2 to their bravery check. So that slows down the assaults if you're sitting on your own minefield hex, and that can be quite handy as well. Let's look at some uses. So we come back to that situation here, and I've thrown some more engineering actions down. And not only do we have a roadblock, we have a mine and entrenched defending units. This, if the Germans let this happen, it's going to take a long time to clear that position. We'll talk about entrenchments in a minute. Entrenchments at least double the survivability, and I'd say maybe even triple the survivability of infantry units occupying them. So this is going to be a major problem for the Germans. The Germans don't want to let that sort of thing happen. The roadblock with the mines and entrenched units, what a nightmare. Let's look at the Greatest Day as another situation where mines can play quite an interesting role. This is a situation that could develop game turn a day 2 or 3. The Canadians have advanced further south. The German 12th SS is kind of bribed and put in some basic defensive positions there, backed up with some tanks on the ridge. I've seen this sort of thing happen near Noyon-Bassin, etc. What happens if we throw minefields into the mix? There is no limit in this game to the number of mines you can place, a little bit like what's going on with Russia and Ukraine. So let's see what kind of defensive position, if you had time, you could develop. Here, say 3 German engineers have spam mines everywhere. You've built your rear guards, which we'll talk about in a second. You've entrenched all the defending units. And suddenly you have the Maginot Line right in front of you. This is the force multiplying thing I'm talking about. It's the same units, but the engineers have at least doubled, it maybe even tripled the defensive abilities of this formation if you have time to do that. And then you will see that time is really an important factor in engineering. All right, another engineering action that can be done by infantry units, usually they're the ones that will be doing the IPs, and also engineers, is placing IPs in entrenchments. What do improved positions do? They subtract 1 from the defense, that's good, the unit occupying them, and they add 1 to its quality rating. Also good. Not a game changer, but it's pretty good. It's not bad to have it. Infantry can do it by making a quality roll. You cannot spend CPs doing this. They can have those digging markers too, so eventually they'll succeed. Engineers can place IPs on themselves or any friendly unit in the hex automatically without making a roll. This is the only way you can get, say, mortars or vehicles into approved positions. And it's something you should keep in mind, that it's a possibility you can actually do that. Entrenchments are sort of conversions of IPs into the next level of defense. Engineers only can do those. They have the unit they're working on themselves, or another unit has to already have an IP on it, and they have to make a quality roll. So the weaker engineers with maybe a quality rating of 3, it's going to take them a while. Some of your good engineers can do this rather quickly. This subtracts 2 from the defense, adds 2 to the quality rating, adds 1 to the attack rating, the fire rating, which is really interesting, and non-armored targets use the armored table when they're being fired upon. This means that that 0 result that happens so much with white, brown, orange fires, which is usually step loss, for infantry, that doesn't happen. That's now a cohesion hit, and you need to get a 4 in order to actually inflict a step on it. If we're thinking of infantry, say in a village with -2, maybe the infantry itself is good and has a -1, and they have a -2 for the defense on the entrenchment, their defense is now -5, and it's going to be very difficult to get a 4. So you don't get step losses on them. Ergo, you have to get 2 cohesion hits and then additional cohesion hits to inflict damage. So this really improves the survivability of your infantry. Do not forget this. If you're on the defense, you want to get units in entrenchments, they have a downside. And that downside is that to leave an entrenchment, if you're not running in assault combat, you have to spend an activation to do that. So pulling out of the entrenchments is pretty tricky. But once you're in there, it's very difficult to root them out. Also, a nice factor with entrenchments is that opponents who want to assault it must make a bravery check, even if there's not a fire zone there. So suppose your unit occupying the entrenchment somehow is suppressed. Normally, that would mean a free assault because you don't have to make a bravery check because there's no fire zone. However, in entrenchments, you do. So that's entrenchments are really, really, really important, and you should be thinking, especially and primarily if you're on the defense in a scenario or a game, how can you get your units entrenched? And as we've learned before, these actions do provide opportunity fire to your opponent, and if you have engineers stacked on infantry, you're going to have bad defense because you have too many stacking points in the hex. So you need to plan ahead for those things. All right, there's one thing to watch out for IPs, and this is more a mental than a game issue. Our 3 factors are moving, striking, and protecting. IPs are to protect, and you can leave an improved position at any point, but in my experience, most players don't want to do that. You get this idea that, okay, well, I've gone to all the trouble of building this IP on here, now I'll just sit here. Don't do that. You have to remember your guys are always 100% mobile, It's not like in actual life, I would be very hesitant as a commander to order my troops to dig in and then leave and then dig in and leave. It's going to wear them out. The only one getting worn out here is you. You know, your units don't actually lose anything if they pick up and go somewhere else. So if you have your units in improved positions, remember you are still just as mobile as you were before, and it might be more important to leave and go do something else than it is to stay in place. So don't let yourself get trapped into thinking that, oh, I'm dug in, now I have to stay here. That's not true. Moving and striking might be the better thing. All right, we're moving to rear guards now. This is also a key aspect of GTS play, and something in my experience I don't see as many people using them as I think they should. What are rear guards? Rear guards are little detachments that infantry units can put out. They can't be in column when they do so. It's an engineer action. You have to make your quality roll. You can stack those markers, the digging markers, etc. And you take one of the rear guards. These are divisional units, and some divisions don't have them, so it'll depend on the specific game what kind of rear guards they have and how many you have. Within 2 hexes that they could get to with one move. It can't be in an enemy fire zone. And when rear guards are created, here's the Nachhuten as you see everywhere. They can't do anything that activation. They're not activated during that time. They have 0 steps, which means that they're eliminated if they take a cohesion hit, so they're a little more vulnerable. And if you look at the sequence for assault, 0-step units are eliminated before the actual assault happens. So one way to eliminate rear guards is to assault them. They'll get their opportunity fire. You have to make the bravery check. But if you get through all that, they're simply removed and they're gone. So they don't hold up very well. The nice thing about them, though, is that when they're eliminated, you don't actually lose any steps from the unit. They go back in your pool, and you can rebuild them right away. So what are they good for? They are good for sucking up losses. If you throw them in the enemy's way, like we have there, the enemy will need to assault or shoot them, and that means they're taking precious activations to do so, and any losses that are inflicted are losses that are not inflicted on your actual units. So that's nice. They are not so good at holding ground. So think of these as delay lines. You can think of them as security lines thrown out in front of your troops 100 yards or a couple hundred yards, the hex in front of you. They're excellent for that. They slow down the offense. They can protect flanks some by slowing the enemy down, but they can also on occasion be ignored. These German ones actually are white firers, but most rear guards, I don't have them here, are simple pink firers, maybe with a rating of 2. They're not that strong. They're annoying, but they're not deadly. All right, so what are some uses for these? Here we have a situation in the Greatest Day. That's the 6th Airborne. It's deployed maybe at the end of day 1, ready for the 21st Panzer to come up against them. This, looks okay. Mostly open, got the -1 defense. That's nice. But, it's not something the German player will be afraid of looking at this. Let's add some rear guards to it. Let's say they've had a few turns to pump out a bunch of rear guards, and there are a bunch of rear guards in the 6th Airborne. You can see now it's going to take a lot longer to assault. If a German comes up with a tank with a range of 3, here they come, range 3 to these infantry, but now they're stuck next to these units and can't actually shoot at the infantry. They're going to have to plow through all these rear guards. And while they are eliminating these rear guards and spending precious activations, they're vulnerable to artillery, perhaps even these anti-tank guns that are loitering in the back, or the mortars. And the units here that are in their improved positions can keep cranking out rear guards as they're killed and dumping them in the front line. And they have a very good chance of doing so. Their morale is, I think, 6 or 7, +1 there. So they're going to make their quality roll almost every time. So as the German is eliminating these rear guards, new rear guards will enter the defense. This is going to gum up the works for German assault for many activations. And that's all free. You don't have to do anything extra. Divisional activations will get all these units trying to create new rear guards. It could be even worse for the Germans. If the rear guards are given a turn or 2, they can build improved positions because they are mobile rear guards. They can move, and thus they can build IPs. This, doesn't help them that much. Another -1 defense is annoying, but it looks impressive, and that can affect your opponent's morale. And they may go, oh, this is going to take forever. And maybe they'll even send the 21st Panzer somewhere else because of the impressive defense you've put up with these rear guards. Another sweet use of rear guards is in Race for Bastogne. This is the opening situation near Clairvaux. At the very beginning of the game, you have the German infantry, strong engineering support, which is advanced during the night across the river. They don't have any mobility, they're foot in this game. Just a little infantry company here in Malnauch, I think, and a rear guard deployed, and there's another, I think they're recon infantry in Clairvaux, and another infantry down here, which I've started in column. So not a great defense. Clairvaux is really important, not much there. However, probably the German will activate the 26th Volksgrenadier at the bottom, which is below the map here as their first. Let's say, and of course the US has bought their formation chit for the 110. You have to do that the first turn of this game, in my opinion. What could it look like with rear guards? All right, so here's the RR unit. We'll say that it pumped out. We'll just say it made its quality roll of 4, a rear guard here, then took a second activation, moved up. This unit was down here and moved up here and deployed, ready to help out. This dug-in unit here created a rear guard there. And now, already, we're thinking, okay, the Germans are going to have some problems here. This was all open before their activation. Now it's getting a little clogged up. Let's say the US get both their division and their formation activation before 2nd Panzer comes up. It could look like this. You create another rear guard down here. This unit creates one right there. You've eliminated the rear guard that you have out of play here. It's another pot where it does nothing. And you can even start digging in this rear guard right here. So this could be even before 2nd Panzer gets to move at all. I hope you can see this is a much easier or better way for the US to defend this area from the initial attack, because you want to keep them as far from Clairvaux, far away from it as possible. There will be a time in the next game day when the tanks start showing up, and then it becomes a little trickier to do that. But this is, you can see how rear guard can really clutter up mobility and the ability of a formation to attack. Throw the mortar into play. There's an artillery unit here. In a few turns, you'll probably have some regular artillery that can help out. And now, I would say that without help from a regiment of the 26th Volksgrenadier to the south, the US is going to have a much better ability with their rear guards to defend this whole area. All right, so we'll move into the tips and tricks here. Maybe about 8 of them. How can you use your engineers effectively in this game? The first one is enjoy spam. It reminds me of the hunting trips I took with my dad where we take spam with us. But spam those rear guards, just as you saw in that last thing. Embrace it. Maybe it's a little funny. You don't have it in other games, but make it work for you. Enjoy or learn to enjoy your spam. Second, if you've got engineering units, make an effort to have them always busy doing something useful. This means you have to think ahead and plan what they'll be up to, but don't just let your engineers sit around. At the very least, they can be creating some roadblocks somewhere, perhaps some mines, going around and even helping put some IPs on units. They should always be up to something useful. Don't forget that an engineering action has to be the first action, but you can move after that. I love to save some CPs for this. If there's a line of units that I'm trying to build entrenchments on, I build the entrenchment as the engineer action, and then I second action move it to the next stack, and then they can get to work on the next activation building the next entrenchment. So this doubles their speed. Save up those CPs to be moving engineers so that in their second action after they build or after they do whatever they're doing to nearly double their speed. When you look at your engineers, look at the quality rating. That's important. If it's low, like a 3, you need to leave a lot of turns for them to do whatever they need to work up to. And you can also decide maybe I'm going to do them for something that doesn't take a quality roll, like putting IPs on units. The weaker engineer is just as effective as a better one in that situation. Removing mines also for engineers, the QR doesn't matter. It just matters how many steps are left with the unit. So keep that in mind as you plan your engineering units. Get all your rear guards out there. They should all be deployed at some point in the game. If they're not, you need to rethink things. Get those out there. They're quite useful. This is something else, planning in depth, because engineers are vulnerable and need a lot of time to create those entrenchments and those mines. you have to think about how far back can you do that. You don't want them too close to the front line, or they become very vulnerable and their activities might be interrupted and it might end up being a waste. So I find that if I'm in a defensive role, I like to have an active defense forward and my engineers maybe 8 or 10 hexes back, creating that second reinforced line to fall back to. A handy use for entrenchments is to entrench your indirect firers. So not artillery parks. Units in artillery parks can't be in entrenchments or IPs, but others can. And that +1 to the attack is quite helpful. The +2 to the QR rating is also very helpful, because especially, well, primarily if it's a 2-step unit, because that increases the chances that they're going to make their company bonus roll. One nice thing, I think it's in The Greatest Day, there is a German 5-strength brown fire. In an entrenchment, it's a 6, which means it always creates a heavy barrage whenever it hits. That is quite useful. It's a minor detail, but something to be kept in mind. I love entrenching mortars with 2 steps. Maybe they've got a 4. This goes up to a 5. They make their quality roll a lot. It means 7. That's some pretty serious firepower. So think about entrenchments on your indirect fires, and even just improve positions. They add 1 to the quality roll. You know, it's not a bad thing if you've got nothing better for them to be doing. All right, the last thing, my last tip here is target enemy engineers. This is some of the games. It's really important if you're playing Race for Baston. As the Germans, you want to really hammer any American engineer in your range. This can mean that you decide to send armor formations after them. It can mean that you dedicate artillery to harassing them, whatever it takes, because all those potential entrenchments can be a real nightmare if you're on the assault. So target enemy engineers. Now, obviously, if your opponent's not doing anything with the engineers, then maybe you don't have to do that. But in a lot of games, they will be. And so engineers should be, in many cases, your #1 target. If you're playing, say, I'm thinking of the Market Garden game, The Devil's Cauldron. German engineers are super important there, in my opinion. So even as you're planning your airstrikes or other things, maybe go after the engineers instead of the tanks. That might be your better play. All right, en revue, or zusammengefasst, or in review. We looked at roadblocks. Hard to use, but they do have their moments, so keep that in mind. Mines, we looked at the rear guards, which should be out there in all those games, and the use of IPs and entrenchments. Hopefully that's been of some help. That's all I have to say for this episode. And I will be doing one final episode in this series, finally finishing it off, and that will be a bit on air power, and then my top 10 tricks or hints for improving your GTS game.
So die.